If you join me in a prayer, and then we'll turn it over to our musicians, our 13th Street Band, to lead us. Let's pray together. Oh God, truly it is an honor and a privilege and a blessing to be together this evening. Open our hearts and minds as Rabbi Zedek speaks to us about universal values, how we can learn through folklore and stories. We know, God, that you're at work in our lives, in us and around us at all times. Rabbis reminded us to watch for you in the ordinary. We would pray that you would keep our eyes and minds open. All this we pray together. And the people say, amen.
Good evening, everyone. Excited to say the first song we're all going to sing together, I bet you all know and have sung for many, many years. It was composed in 1840s by a teenager, by a young Welsh church musician. It's the tune called Hyfrydol. And I would venture to say, although I've not done a study of this, that if you looked in every major Christian denomination or even non-denominational hymn book, Hyfrydol is in there. It's one of these classically great hymns. You'll recognize it as soon as you hear it. But tonight, based on what we've learned the last couple of days, even though many of us have sung this tune all of our life, we're going to experience it anew, right? Like it's the first time. Two reasons for that. One reason, we're going to do it in a jazz style. So there will be jazz harmonies, and they fit really well with this 19th century tune. But I'm sure Mr. Pritchard would probably be surprised to hear his melody set in with those harmonies. And then the second thing is, of course, the text, which, as you sing it, notice how it invites us. It's a beautiful text, which is all about finding your quiet center, finding a place where God's presence can be deeply felt, and we can start noticing all those burning bushes that are around us. The second song that we're going to do is, I believe, and I hope I'm not saying this wrong, David, but I believe, was it in the fall that you did an informal poll? It's like, what's the favorite scriptural quote of Boston Avenue? And was it the Micah? It was the Micah text. So the second song we're going to sing is based on the Micah text. So this is a pop quiz. I'm going to start this text, and I'm going to stop. And I want you to finish the statement, okay? So what does the Lord require of me? To act, to love, mercy, and to walk humbly. Amen. So the year was 1774. And in order to understand this story, it's a really interesting story behind the next song that we're going to sing. You need to know about a man named Thomas Olivers. Mr. Olivers had a very difficult life. He was an orphan in the early parts of his life. He lived on the street, and he had to make a life as he could, and so basically he was a ruffian. But somewhere in the middle of his life, he met some Methodists, and he kind of turned his life around, and eventually he decided to study to become a lay preacher, and he got this wonderful gig. He became, in the early 1770s, and I'm not sure exactly when, he became John Wesley's personal assistant. Okay? Now, I'm reading a little bit between the lines, but when you read about his life, you get a sense that he was a people person. He enjoyed meeting people. So he saw as part of his training was to meet and learn about all kinds of different faith traditions. So he met and had friends everywhere, apparently, and including the Jewish community as well. So it would not be unusual for him to be at a Shabbat service. And one particular day, he was there, and they had a very famous cantor. This was called the Great Synagogue of London, and he heard the setting of the, and I want to make sure I get this, the Yigdal, which is, it's not a creed. If you read about it, I was just talking to a rabbi, it's not specifically a creed, but it's a chant which is about the values and commit to traditions. That's kind of like a creed, but not exactly a creed. But anyway, Mr. Olivers fell in love with not just the words, but also the tune. And so, but he didn't know the cantor, so he went up to introduce himself, said, let's have a few at the pub, so they had some pints. And he convinced the cantor to let him borrow the music and the words. And so from the tune and the text, he made an English kind of paraphrase. 12 stanzas he wrote. We'll just sing 4. But we sing it all the time in worship. It's in many Protestant worship books as well. It's called the Lord, or the God of Abraham Praise. This version leans heavily toward the Jewish roots of the song. Rob is the arranger of it. So let's stand and sing the God of Abraham Praise.
wonderful director welcoming, Belinda Clanton, to advise you that as Rabbi Zedek approaches the podium, the house lights will turn on, literally and metaphorically, I would say. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Rabbi Michael Zedek in his final lecture of the 2022 Barton-Clinton-Gordey Series here at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. A mentor of mine in the arts world once declared, 80% of what you teach is who you are. And if this is true, then we have gotten to know Rabbi Zedek a great deal over the last few days. We already know he is passionate about Holy Scriptures, the etymology of words, and yes, about stories. And in his understanding, he has come to share to us tools of spiritual awareness to unlock many of their inner secrets. Be on the lookout, particularly for those ways of thinking this evening. He has had the blessing of a life full of work leading two Jewish congregations in Kansas City and Chicago, and also as a student of the wonder that is God. Together with his wife, Karen, he is the father of two accomplished daughters. Technically, he's still retired, but still writing, speaking, live on the radio every Sunday, and teaching at the St. Paul School of Theology. And we are so glad that he is still working, even in retirement, because the world needs people like him. Today, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Zedek as a Barton-Clinton-Gordey speaker, but also as the first Barton-Clinton-Gordey artist. If I may, to illustrate my point, an art reference. In 1975, just a year after Michael Zedek became Rabbi Zedek, Joan Miró, the great Catalan surreal artist, yes, the one that drew pictures that might look like something that my 1.5-year-old could do. Now, in all seriousness, it is a little more complex than that, I promise. He made a series of 22 prints that he called Acrostic Wonders in Miró's Garden. The prints were variations on themes he had played with for many years, filled with signs and codes, made of perfect scribbles, squiggles, lines, blotches of primary colors with personal and universal meaning at the same time. At the height of his career, he had already developed a language, but then he turned it into an acrostic or puzzle, only to go back to it, to rearrange and reinterpret it, to find new connections and find new meanings in it again. If there was ever a secret to art, this is it. Rabbi Zedek, his garden is filled with signs and symbols, tales and stories, mysticism and spirituality. And as he revisits these and tends to the flowers, new meaning is found again and again. I would encourage you to look for the creative spirit in his presentation and the artistry in the telling of his lessons. The joy that emanates from it is holy. And we are holy to be in this special moment of learning together. Welcome, Rabbi Michael Zedek.
Bid it, Lord, that justice lies in tatters cold and dead. Outside these walls run desperate streets, where greed is law and life is sheep. We bar the doors, refuse to see or hear the words you said. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Convict us, Lord, we dance and laugh, ignoring those who weep. Correct us, Lord, our golden calf has lulled our hearts to sleep. The gap between the rich and poor grows ever wider, shore to shore. There's racial hate, religious war, and wolves among the sheep. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Fill us, Lord, and purify our hands to work for you. Enlist us, Lord, to serve nearby and cross the waters too. Your image bearers on the earth will never know how much they're worth unless we love and help them first and show the way to you. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Justice roll like a river, let it roll. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll. Let justice roll like a river, let it roll.
Woo. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. By the way, before I start, a couple of things. One, fascinating choice of last song because my last name, Zedek in Hebrew, is the Hebrew word for justice. Did you guys know that? No? Well, so there. Second, where's Jose Luis? I so much want to believe what you just said. But we're all imperfect instruments, and This one has a few cracks in it as well, but thank you so very much. And as long as I'm thanking, I want to thank you all for this extraordinary experience for me. I've rarely been so welcomed in church. but I do mean that with the seriousness of heart. Your community is extraordinary. Your leadership is exceptional. Your staff is amazing. Your building's pretty good, too. And the food has been excellent. So that said, Jose Luis, in your introduction and your hyperbole, you suggested a couple of things, one of which is going to show up in this presentation about gardens. I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to end up with some of the stories involving gardens. And the other is the suggestion of a person being a particular model. It reminded me immediately of a suggestion in translation from the German by Rabbi Leo Beck. Does anyone know that name? Rabbi Leo Beck was the leader of the German Jewish community during World War II. He was incarcerated in Theresienstadt, the so-called model concentration camp. And one of the things he said is, more important than any sermon the rabbi gives is the sermon the rabbi is. Now, watch out. It's true of all of us. You don't even have to be a rabbi. What is the message, and do you live it, not just give it? Additionally, he suggested on one occasion, because he was a German scholar, which meant he paid attention to endless details, and his students didn't like it. And he said to them, the details are also holy. And that's certainly something that we need to integrate, that the details are, in fact, also holy. And I'm going to take all of the details of this experience into my experience with joy and uplift and celebration. And I truly thank you so much for them. And let's hope he does a decent job tonight, okay? So, Folklore and Stories, one last thing. Did anybody remember the picture that was up there? I'd like a copy of it, if possible. Here's the reason. I thought I needed a haircut. My wife says, don't cut your hair. Now, of course, she wins, right? But how many think yes, how many think no? What do you think? I don't have that much, you know. But okay, but I'd love to have that picture so we can have that debate at home. Okay. As Jose Luis and as many of you know, I love stories. Not the least of the reasons being that I truly believe that the story allows us to hear and remember and sabotage. It can outflank our resistance to change. Because stories can often tell us something about our best, even when we're not functioning that way, and they can remind us to get on track. That said, tonight I'm going to present a version of A Story's Worth 1,000 Facts, and I originally planned for us to have about 50,000 facts, but we're not going to be able to get there tonight only. Among the ways in which this whole presentation got started in me is long ago having a bull session with some colleagues. What's different about human beings? What separates us from the rest of life with which we share the planet? Now, one of the things aside, this is meant to be tongue firmly in cheek, that may separate us from all the other animals is that we think we need to find something that separates us from all the other animals. But the traditional response used to be, human beings are the only mammals with language. And then, of course, the porpoises put that one to rest, right? So then we went to human beings are the only animals that are tool makers. Jane Goodall gave the lie to that one, right? Okay, human beings are the only animals that have an awareness of mortality, of death. Any of you who've had animals know that something's going on. They've done amazing research with elephants and their sense of mourning and remembering and memorializing. And since I spent no small amount of time in Chicago, when the matriarch of the chimpanzee exhibit died, the other members of that cohort went into deep mourning. They had something equivalent to a wake in commemoration. A small aside, when Karen and I married, she had blessedly married. When Karen and I married, she had a cat and I had a dog. Didn't go well at first, but they ended up being best friends. So much so that when the cat died, the dog went into deep mourning, wouldn't get out of his bed. I mean, at any rate, human beings may have a longer horizon about the reality that we're dead, will die, but other animals have that experience. Here's the big difference. Human beings are storytellers. So far as we know, no other animals tell stories. But why? And the why is really important. It's because we are meaning seekers. We are the only ones that we know of who think our existence is a problem that needs to be solved. That there must be some formula, solution, etc. And so we tell stories. Now, scholars of literature would claim that there are really only 7 stories, 7 basic plots. Some of you have heard that before. There are even modifications nowadays that there's only 6. 7, 6. What that means is the familiarity of a particular tale will be much in your awareness, even as a particular culture will put its value stamp on the story, aside of some consequence. Leo Tolstoy said there's not 7 stories, there's not 6 stories. He said there's only 2. The first story begins, a stranger came to town. And think of how many novels, movies, etc., that are based on that introduction. I mean, every Clint Eastwood movie ever made. He's the stranger who comes to town. And what do we do with strangers? We are more than anxious by them, right? Nowadays, we're fearful of them. But in the Clint Eastwood movie, in the modality of that plot, there's always one person, the woman, the love interest, who's going to fall in love with him, the stranger, because he's exotic, he's exciting, he's a new input into my life, and she's wasting her time because you know at the end of the movie he's going to ride out on his horse, but she'll always have Paris, whatever, okay. The other story begins. I went on a long journey. And Pilgrim's Progress, Chaucer's Tales, etc., etc. Now here's where I think there's a real, I'm going to use a fancy word, pleonasm, coming together. It won't be in a crossword puzzle soon, I promise you. The biblical story can be understood in the following fashion. Not I, we are on a long journey. And we are the strangers who come to town. You can unpack almost all of biblical history in its acting out in endless centuries. We are the strangers who come to town, and we are on a long journey. So with that said, I want to take a good look at some stories. As a notion, as I said, it's a window into culture. How many of you have ever heard of Valhalla? The Viking notion of, to use the traditional word, heaven, right? So here is Valhalla. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. You will know no more nor less about heaven, but you'll know a heck of a lot about Viking culture and values. Automatic admission, die in battle. Probably a good, clear indication that this is a warrior society. Right? In Valhalla, you fight all day against the most worthy of adversary, and at the setting of the sun, your wounds are miraculously healed, and you retire to the mead hall. Now, those of you who follow United Methodist tradition, don't listen. A mead hall is a word for tavern. And you drink all night without any ill effect, and here's a word that you don't hear every day. You are served by the most desirable and willing serving wenches who are at your beck and call. And then at the rising of the sun, you do it all over again. Now, the first thing you can unpack from that is clearly, men wrote this story. I mean, it's a warrior story. Compare that to the following. First of all, absolutely stunning. Jewish tradition, as you may know, does not come to speculation. It comes to speculation about afterlife quite late in the journey. It's almost extraordinary that this book of religious conviction is ambiguous about what happens at the end of this journey. One of the first notions of speculation within Jewish tradition is heaven is a schoolroom. That may be some person's view of hell, right? But heaven is a schoolroom where you study all day with the most worthy scholars of all time, and at the end of the day, you do it again and again. Now, one small detail. The most worthy of scholars, not just the Jewish scholars. Second, it clearly suggests that the life of the mind is somehow a precious value that we want to extend when we speculate about what may be at the end of our experience. And that's part of the Jewish obsession. Not vigor of strength of arm, but strength of thought, of mind, of reflection, of creativity. So, we've not learned a thing about afterlife, but we've learned a thing about two cultures' values. With that as background, a story I told, I think in the podcast, that they promised they would pretend they hadn't heard before. This story comes from Buddhism, and it involves the following. A woman's only child dies. She goes to see the Buddha. Restore my child to life. He says to her, bring me a mustard seed from a home that has not known sorrow, and I will restore your child to life. Now, by the way, you could do a book this thick about mustard seed stories and folklore, including your sacred literature. Why did Jesus talk about a mustard seed? Anybody know? It would be the modern equivalent of saying, bring me the smallest amount of give me a subatomic particle. Because a mustard seed is extraordinarily small. And I will do what you're asking. But she, in the Buddhist telling of this story, understands there's no such home. A mustard seed from a home that has not known sorrow, it doesn't exist. And in the story, she resigns and leaves to her fate. Here's the Jewish version of that story. A woman's only child dies, and you guys pronounce it again? Elisha. In Jewish tradition, it's Elisha, the one who comes after Elijah. We both pronounce that one the same way. Yeah, okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier today, it's the right one for folklore to pick because in the Hebrew Bible, he does a CPR-like reviving of a child who seems to have died. Woman goes to Elisha and says, restore my child to life. He says to her, guess what he says to her? Bring me a mustard seed from a home that has not known sorrow, and I'll restore your child to life. Sounds familiar, right? And now it diverges from the Buddhist story. She goes looking. No one could imagine a Jewish mother not trying to find the key that would bring what she needs and wants so desperately. Many years later, they meet. An exquisite detail of the folklore of this story. He recognizes her. They don't recognize each other. He recognizes her and he goes up to her and says, why didn't you come back to me? And she says, at first I was desperately looking for that mustard seed that would restore my child to life. But I found in every home I entered there was pain. And I was too busy trying to relieve pain to return to you. The first story has a wisdom. It's the wisdom of acceptance. What is what is what is. It's at the heart of what makes Eastern religion and Eastern philosophy the specific of the great Mandela, the eternal cycle, recurrence. It is what is and always will be. The second story teaches that which makes the West, for good or ill. It's the wisdom of struggle. It's the wisdom of battling against the world as it is in order to get closer to the world as it should be. In the world as it is, children die. In the world as it should be, no. And we will tilt at the windmills endlessly. And we've pushed the boundaries, haven't we? But not sufficiently. The wisdom of acceptance, the wisdom of struggle. Sometimes we choose the wrong wisdom, by the way. The other footnote I would add is that story teaches that you can't get better unless you're helping someone else get better. She will never be whole. No one recovers from, God forbid, that kind of tragic experience. But she can get better, and she does by helping and sharing in others' pain. So, with that, I want to go to one of the oldest stories that we have. This story is at least 5,000 years old. It's called the Enuma Elish, and if David studied it in seminary, he's now having nightmares. Daymares, I guess you would call it, right? It's the creation myth of ancient Mesopotamia. And by the way, it's called the Enuma Elish because those are the first words. Okay. Titles are a fairly recent invention. But, for example, what you call Genesis is called Genesis because the first Hebrew word is in the beginning in Hebrew. We call it Bereshit, which is the first Hebrew word. Exodus is called Exodus because it's a drama of leaving, but in Hebrew it's called Shemot, which is the first significant word. It means names. Okay, so the Enuma Elish. I want you to be detectives. When on high, which is what that word means, those two words mean, the gods are at war. So what have we learned already? One, there are gods, and they are in battle with each other. The war is indecisive because how can gods fight to a conclusion? And the gods determine that they must resolve the conflict. God, this is a terribly contemporary story, isn't it? The good gods, that is the gods who are going to win, choose as their champion Marduk. Rings a bell? By the way, the English name Mordecai is a direct cognate of that name. And if you're a Star Trek fan, because they always liked exotic names, they would use things like Marduk. So, good gods, Marduk. The bad gods, that is the gods who are going to lose, choose as their champion Tiamat. Now watch closely. As I like to say, my fingers are going to never leave my hand. Tiamat is a goddess. She is in the form of a serpent, and her name means chaos. Clearly, men wrote this one. All the ambivalence that the male has about the female in one word. She's a goddess, and she's chaos. And we blame you, right? Marduk meets Tiamat in single combat. He defeats her. And in his victorious frenzy, he cuts up her various body parts. And from those body parts, critical word, by accident, our world comes to be. If it's an accident, not with any intent or design, it is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, correct? That's what the story, this mythic construction, clearly conveys. Now here's where I'd like your help. What body part do you think gave rise to you and me? You won't be wrong. You'll just be mirroring your values, right? Because that's what these stories do. Myths are not falsehoods. They're roadmaps of the reality in which people live. So which body part? Somebody be bold and try. Heart? What? Who said heart? A lot of us. So somebody, why heart? Oh, because we associate, by the way, this is all symbolic on our part. The heart is not the seat of our emotions, but we associate, I heart you means I'm saying something, right? And we're feeling creatures. Wrong. Good try, but wrong. And yes, the head, what, because of thinking? Okay, good try. By the way, for the ancients, the heart was the seat of intelligence, not the head. The Egyptians threw away the brain. It was a vestigial organ. Pharaoh hardens his heart, I mentioned the hearing of some of you, means not that he didn't feel like letting the slaves go. He had no idea what Moses was talking about. Because those are slaves. They are not people. They are property. The Hebrew Bible invents the notion of a person. Doesn't exist before that. But head, good idea, wrong. By the way, for the ancients, wasn't it the liver which was the seat of emotion? I think it was the four vapors. Having a moment here. Any other suggestions? Yes. Oh, what a not. Oh. Can we talk about that in church? I've never heard that one before, but it's a great one. It's just not the right one. But the generative notion is wonderful. Excellent. Yeah. Blood everywhere. Ooh, I don't think I want to hang out with you at night. So, all right, I'll end the suspense. Human beings, according to this story, this roadmap, are created from the stuff inside her intestines. Not fully formed poop. That's the politest term I could come up with. What do you do with poop? Before the invention of the flush toilet, you cover it in sand. Now, all I'm trying to suggest is it's a clear indication that human beings are not of any value. Fair? And if you know anything about Mesopotamian history, boy, does that hit the nail on the head. Let's go to a different part of the world. Egypt. Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, right? Because for most of Egyptian history, people lived on a 2-mile strip on either side of the Nile, and they had those extraordinary deserts to protect them. For the over 3,000-year history of what we would call ancient Egypt, it was only conquered twice. Alexander, maybe the Hyksos, and the end of this story is with Julius Caesar. That's a rare experience, which is to say, as you may be aware, before they built the Aswan Dam, every year the Nile would flood. And while the Nile floods, you have to sit around and wait. It was the source of fertility, but it is also the case that tells us Egypt was the first society to have leisure time. It's not an accident that in that leisure time, Egypt is the first place for poetry, the first place for perfume, the first place for beer. There's no rush. You put this stuff, oh, look what happened. Among other things, Egypt had a multiplicity of creation stories. This is one of their favorites. The gods are having a party. Very different than the gods are at war, right? And it's not because Mesopotamia was a warrior area. It's because Mesopotamia is an open plain. It's perfect for tank warfare. It's perfect. If I want what you've got and I'm stronger, I can take it. Because there's no natural boundaries. Egypt has the natural boundaries of deserts. The gods are having a party. The chief god has too much to drink. You and me. Again, a perfect example of a value expression, a roadmap to reality. And in that world comes this outrageous, incredible, almost enough to make you believe in Revelation, idea that we call the creation story in Genesis, which says the world has intent and design and purpose and form and function. I'm just an easy example. You get the grasses before you get the animals. It's a good thing they wouldn't have anything to eat. And at the end of this journey, an almost evolutionary journey, you get human beings who are created with image of God. Which is to say, we ain't poop or vomit. We are of infinite value. We are sacred instruments. That's got to be what it means, don't you think? Well, here's what it means. My favorite story. Right, maybe right now is my favorite. Probably the next story will be equal. This is the one I shared about the little girl. It could be a rabbi, it could be a minister, it could be an imam. After a children's service, a mother and daughter are walking out of the service, and the little daughter says in an outdoor voice, which shouldn't be in church, "Mommy, the rabbi's sermon confused me." I was concerned, if I were telling the story as though it happened to me, that the mommy might say, "Oh, don't worry, he confuses everyone." But the mommy said, "Why is that, honey?" And the little girl said, "Mommy, the rabbi said God is bigger than we are. Is that true?" "Oh, that's true, honey. God is bigger than we are." And even if you have trouble with the notion of God, the universe is bigger than we are. But Mommy, the rabbi said there's a part of God in every one of us. And that's the outrageous, incredible claim of the Hebrew Bible, that there's a part of the sacred, divine in every one of us. That's true, honey. There's a part of God in every one of us. And then this little girl said what I think is one of the greatest theological statements ever. She said, Mommy, if God is bigger than we are and God lives in us, wouldn't God show through? And you've known people where that's true, even though you might not use that language as a way to understand and express what you've experienced. They're filled with God. Enthusiasm comes from the Greek word, enthusiasmos, to be full of God. So, all right, that's what it means. Some of you are familiar with one of my favorite musicals, Les Miserables. Near the end of his life, Jean Valjean sings, and it's near the end of his life. This truth that is forever certain, to love another person is to see the face of God. So what does it mean if human beings are created in the image of God? Story. Any of you ever heard of Harry Golden? He was a storyteller popular in the 50s and 60s. I'm stealing the story from him. When he was a teenager, now some of you have survived teenagers, right? In fact, I spent many years in Missouri, so I'm obligated to have every story have either a Mark Twain or a Harry Truman reference. I've got both if we have time tonight. But Mark Twain once said, when a child reaches age 13, put him a barrel and feed him through the hole. When he reaches age 16, seal up the hole. Now, the only point of that is that teenagers are God's way of wanting to let them go. Otherwise, we quite literally would never let them go. So back to Harry. Harry was a teenager, and his father was part of an immigrant moment in American history. Between 1880 and 1920 was the largest movement of human population until the present time. More than 20 million souls left their homes to come to these shores. Until we shut the door, after all. Ooh. His father was one of those, and his father was part of a peculiar moment in Jewish history. He was a socialist atheist who went to synagogue all the time. The son, Harry, as a teenager, attacking the inconsistencies of his father, because that's what teenagers do, accepting their own quite casually, right? Said to his father, Pop, why do you go to synagogue? You know, don't take any of that stuff seriously. In defending himself, the father said, Son, do you know Garfinkel? Yeah, of course I know Garfinkel. Garfinkel's your best friend. Well, Garfinkel goes to synagogue to talk to God. I go to synagogue to talk to Garfinkel. But the deeper meaning is when you are really talking with Garfinkel, you are getting as close as we can to talking, meeting, and seeing the face of God. Martin Buber put it this way. We become what we are, children of God, by becoming what we are, brothers, and if he were alive today, he would add, and sisters of each other. No wonder God's in trouble, because we're in trouble with each other, right? Yeah, at least that's the sermon I haven't given yet. So, with all of that, one needs to recognize that the main religion of America is not Christianity, and certainly not Judaism. It's materialism. It's the sure and absolute conviction that happiness comes from things, right? You know the old teacher, whoever dies with the most things wins, although Lily Tomlin put it brilliantly. What's the use of winning the rat race if you're still going to be a rat? But television is the cathedral for that religion. And it's actually in trouble because now that we can DVR and skip the commercials, because the commercials are the real storytelling vehicle, the programs exist only as an excuse to have those commercials. And every commercial teaches three things. One, there is no problem for which there is not a solution, which is quick, and all it requires is money. That's the lesson. So, back to folklore. Two dogs were having a conversation, a young pup and an older dog. And the young pup says, I have discovered that the secret of happiness is in my tail. The only problem is no matter how much I chase it, I can't catch it. The older dog says, you're absolutely right. The secret of happiness is in your tail. But I have learned that if you leave it alone, it often follows after you. The point being that, seriously, I grew up with the notion, translated, we just want you to be happy. But if that is the goal, you're going to end up very sad. The goal is to live a life that matters, to make a difference. And maybe the dividend you get with that is a sense of fulfillment, which is even more significant than happy. Happy is a temporary state. Fulfillment can sustain us. All right, so dogs. True story. This is a long ago circumstance. I was at my desk doing work I didn't want to do, the administrative stuff. I get a phone call from the chaplain's office at Baptist Memorial Hospital. There's this patient we think you need to see. Someone needs me. Ta-da! I'm down at the hospital. As soon as I walk in the room, I know I'm in trouble. Some of you know the name Coco Chanel. She once said, by the time you're age 50, you have the face you deserve. You know, whether let me put it this way. It says something negative about me. Had she been a book, I wasn't going past the cover. She was absolutely marinated in rage. That was her default. She was in the hospital, something that wouldn't happen any longer, for a severely broken arm and a broken leg. She was angry at the doctors because they weren't going to get her well quickly enough to suit her demanding schedule. She was angry at the nurses because they were tending to more seriously needing patients. She was angry at God because God seemed to think ice served some purpose. That was the proximate cause that got her in the hospital. He was angry at me because I walked into the room. I thought I was supposedly there. They tricked me. Now, if I did anything, it was just to be another place for her to throw out some more rage. I was at the hospital, so what the heck? I went to see another person whom I knew was there. She was paralyzed from the neck down, and she smiled at me. I'll never forget it, I hope. Where did she get the audacity to smile, to make a difference that I'm telling you about 42 years later in my life? What an extraordinary moment. Now, is my habit, especially when I had weekly preaching, I would read like crazy every night before going to bed. I was constantly looking for illustrations. I know you're going to be shocked at this. I tried never to repeat a story. Remind me of that, will you? Because I've got a story about repeating a story. So you're always looking for material, more and more illustrations, examples, etc. That night, I read the following. The difference between fate and destiny. Fate is the cards we are dealt. Destiny is how we play the cards we are dealt. My lady, paralyzed, a quadriplegic, had terrible cards. But my gosh, was she playing the heck out of that hand. Yeah. I to this day, admire it. Then it went on. 2 children are playing in a garden. The first child comes rushing in and says, Mommy, Mommy, what a cruel place the garden is. All the thorn bushes have roses on them. The second child comes rushing in and says, Mommy, Mommy, what a beautiful place the garden is. All the thorn bushes have roses on them. Now in psychology, that's called reframing. But it's more than reframing. Most of you know, life is much more like thorn bush than it is rose garden. Even though my parents promised me a rose garden, they forgot that there were thorns there. They didn't tell me about that. And some of us literally fall apart when we find that there are thorns. Because I think the world is divided into why me's and what can I do nowers. I do not understand how it happens. But let me put it this way. There are folks you know who get a metaphorical hangnail and their whole world falls apart. And there are people who suffer indignity after indignity and they still think this is a worthwhile journey and they can make a difference in that journey. Awesome, overwhelming, amazing. I wish I knew how to create more and more of them. Little transition. Do I have about 10 minutes? Yeah? Okay, all right. Oldest Jewish joke I know. I'm going to translate it from the Yiddish because I want to be faithful to it because it's a chauvinistic joke, and I'll point out where it is. 2 souls die as though it were possible. That's important to the story because our tradition is comfortable with the not knowing. As though it were possible, they stand before God in judgment. The first soul, the record is examined, a good life, a good person. But on one occasion, violated a category of Jewish law, which is translated as needless destruction. You don't do something negative nonchalantly. So he had stepped on a spider that was in no way interfering with his world, and, needless destruction, condemned to spend eternity in a small box with the spider that he killed. Next soul up is horrified, knows what the record will show. Again, a good life, a good person. Now here's the chauvinism. Succumbed to the charms of a beautiful woman. We would put it more appropriately, engaged in an extramarital affair. God in the story, at least, is a just God. Condemned to spend eternity in a small box with the woman he committed adultery with. And the moral of the story is that if you're going to sin, don't be a jerk. More seriously, two more afterlife stories. On his deathbed, a rabbi with the musical name of Zusha, hardly anybody names their child Zusha anymore, is troubled. His students are gathered round him, and what's troubling you? You've led a good and wondrous life. When I stand before God in judgment, God won't say to me, Zusha, why weren't you more like Moses? How could I be like Moses? Or Zusha, why weren't you more like Jeremiah? How in the world could I rise to the level of Jeremiah? But when God says to me, Zusha, why weren't you more like Zusha? How will I be able to defend myself? Another story in that vein. This rabbi has an even more challenging name, Elimelech. By the way, it means God is my ruler. When I stand before the heavenly court, they will ask me, did you study enough? I will have to be answered. I will answer no. Did you pray enough? No. Did you give enough to charity? No. And they will say to me, well, at least you're honest. For this you deserve admission into paradise. I agree. It's a beautiful and a chuckle. So one more, and then the one about stories, repeating stories. This is about a rabbi named Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Berdichev is one of the cities under attack right now. It's in Ukraine. And Levi Yitzchak, 18th century, was reputed to be the greatest speaker of his age. Yom Kippur afternoon, the most important day in the Jewish calendar, he closes his eyes in contemplation. Now, I want you to know, rabbis never fall asleep in the service. They always close their eyes in contemplation. But it's a story. No, it's just a story. It never happened. He closes his eyes in contemplation, and in the story, he's transported to the heavenly realm. It's Yom Kippur afternoon. You're Levi Yitzchak. He gives a speech. Now, we don't know the speech because it's not true. It's just a story. But the story tells us that he said, God, you've got to do something. The world is too difficult to us. You need to bring redemption now. God is so moved by the eloquence of Levi Yitzchak's plea, he says, I'm going to do it. Just then, there's a piteous cry down below, because as you may know, Yom Kippur is a fast day in Jewish tradition, and if the rabbi doesn't get out of his ecstatic vision, he can't finish the service, person can't break their fast. Levi Yitzchak hears this cry. It's Chaim the washerman, a nobody, who has fainted from hunger. Levi Yitzchak gets up to go. The angels in this story are radical liberal progressives. Say, Levi Yitzchak, where are you going to go? God is about to save the world. How can you leave? And he says, who says the price of saving the world should be the life of Chaim the washerman? And he leaves. And the story concludes, Levi Yitzchak, you are saving the world. I would submit to you that to be religious in any serious way is to know that even though that story happened, it contains the deepest truth. When you're just taking care of that nobody, you're saving as much of the world as you or I might do. I've got two more, and then I promise. I've got many more, but I got two more. Two more I got to tell. The story about telling stories. I suggested that I tried very hard never to repeat a story. So this particular story I had told 4 years earlier on a Yom Kippur morning service, and I was teaching a bunch of 12-year-olds to get them ready for their bar bat mitzvah. They had been 4 years earlier at the service, maybe. At the end of my sermon, there's no rhyme or reason why an 8-year-old kid would be listening to the end of someone's sermon. So I started to tell this particular story. The story is about a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Nathan. It's 2,000 years old. He appears in the Talmud only twice. He's a minor character. But they're having a debate in the academy about whether or not it is permissible or forbidden to go to the gladiatorial combats of ancient Rome. The majority says we must stay away from such brutality. And for the first time in his career, Rabbi Nathan opens his mouth. Now, I'm about to tell the story, and a whole bunch of these now 12-year-olds said, "Oh, I remember that story, I remember that story." They wanted to tell it. By the way, I would tell it better, but they wanted to tell it. That was a joke. So here's the story. They ask him, Mahasiba, what is your, they want to kick him out, but first of all, what is your reasoning? He says, well, when the crowd shouts for the blood of the defeated gladiator and goes thumbs down, your job is to shout thumbs up. And my gosh, isn't that a perfect job description for all of us? In a world in which there's endless inputs that are our job for as long as we're here is to shout thumbs up. So, 1.5 more stories. This is also approximately 2,000 years old, pre-Jesus. A rabbi is assigned the responsibility for the community in Jerusalem to go to Rome in order to petition for a redress of grievances. Before he goes, he has a dream. It's just a dream. That when he arrives, he's going to meet the Messiah. He arrives at Rome, be the equivalent of going from Tulsa to New York, right? And in his dream, there's the person. He goes up to the person and says, "Excuse me, are you the Messiah?" And the person says, "Yes." And the rabbi says, "Messiah, in a world filled with such horror and pain, what in God's name are you waiting for? Do something." And the Messiah responds in this story, "I was waiting for you, so I could ask you, in a world filled with such horror and pain, what in God's name are you waiting for? Do something." Last story for this trip. This is a really complicated one. My wife doesn't like this one, so you got to listen to the whole thing. I think she thinks people only listen to the first part. Because if you only listen to the first part, my God, what a xenophobic and chauvinistic story. But it goes in a nuanced direction. How many of you saw the movie The Exorcist? How many of you read any of that stuff? Okay. So exorcisms are not limited only to the Catholic tradition. Exorcisms were commonplace in the Middle Ages when they didn't have a psychological vocabulary. Behavior that was outside of a norm would be viewed as demon possession. So there's a great play in Yiddish called the Dybbuk, in which the rabbi performs an exorcism. Before he does, he gives a speech, and I'm going to paraphrase the speech. All times are holy. Especially holy, now it's a Jewish story, remember, are the holidays. All the holidays are holy, but the most holy holiday in Jewish tradition is the Sabbath. All Sabbaths are holy, but the most holy Sabbath is the Sabbath we call Yom Kippur. It's sometimes called Shabbat Shabbaton, the Sabbath of Sabbaths. Series 1 of 4. 2, all places are holy, especially holy the land of Israel. After all, it's a Jewish story. All places in Israel are holy, but even more holy, Jerusalem. All places in Jerusalem are holy, but the most holy place is the inner sanctum of the ancient temple, the Holy of Holies. All languages are holy, especially holy the Hebrew language. All the words of the Hebrew language are holy, but especially holy are the names for God. All God's names are holy, but the most holy name is the one that you had in your song is Jehovah, which is not how it was pronounced at all, and we don't know how it was pronounced. But the 4-letter name, which in your mosaic you have is Adonai, which is a substitute word for what we think it might have been pronounced. Someday invite me back. I'll unpack some of what that's about. All names of God are holy, but the most holy name is that special, unique name, mispronounced Adonai. It gets more dangerous. All people are holy, and there's nothing I take more seriously than that conviction. All people are holy. Jewish story, especially holy, the children of Israel. All the children of Israel holy, but a little more holy are the ones we call the priests. All the priests are holy, but the most holy is the high priest. And once a year, the most holy person entered the most holy place, Yom Kippur, and he said one word, God's unpronounceable name. Now, in any folklore tradition, that is a moment in which the fate of the world hangs in the balance. That's how folklore works. If it stopped there, I hope I would recognize, it doesn't stop there. He goes on. The secret is, you're now going to know the secret. The secret is, any time can be Yom Kippur afternoon. Any place can be the Holy of Holies. Any person can be the high priest. And here's the most exquisite part. Any word spoken in true sincerity, one to the other, that is God's proper name. Maybe we could make that true someday. And someday, over the rainbow, we'll be there. Blessings, and thank you so very, very much. I got another story. Okay, all right. At this symphony, we get an encore. All right, and all right, 1.5. This was Adlai Stevenson's favorite story. In the days in which it was really unusual for someone to live to be 100, the lowest of the rung reporter would invariably be sent out to interview the person, and the invariable question was, to what do you attribute your longevity, right? So this gentleman, new reporter, is sent to meet this farmer who's celebrating his 100th birthday. And, of course, he asks, what's the secret you attribute your longevity? Well, I would get up early every morning. I would have one shot of, wasn't a United Methodist, one shot of liquor every night, and I'd go to sleep early. So that's amazing. I had an uncle who did exactly the same thing, but he only lived to be 88. Keep it up long enough. So now here's the story I want to tell. It's from Arabic folklore, and it concerns Hamdi. Hamdi is, in many traditional tellings in Arabic tradition, the fool. Except in every serious folklore, the fool is the one with wisdom. Hamdi was assigned 3 weeks in a row the responsibility of giving the lesson, the sermon, at the mosque. First Friday, everyone is assuming they're going to have great fun at Hamdi's expense. He mounts the minhar, the pulpit, and says, good people, do you have any idea what I'm going to talk about? And of course they say no. And he says, well, if you have no idea what I'm going to talk about, there's no reason to waste time. And he leaves. Second week, good people, do you have any idea what I'm going to talk about? And of course, remember what happened the week before? They say, yes. Well, they say, if you already know what I'm going to talk about, there's no reason to waste time. And he leaves. Third week, good people, do you have any idea what I'm going to talk about? Now chaos reigns. Some say yes, some say no. And he says, well, if those of you who know what I'm going to talk about will tell those of you who don't, we'll save a lot of time. And he leaves. The deepest level of the story is we are good people. The challenge is that we need to become better people. And I hope some of what we've shared will help all of us, including me, make that journey a successful one. Thank you again and again. Stop.